I have the pleasure in this podcast to welcome Nomi Bar Yaacov, Associate Fellow of Chatham House in 2011. She has 3 decades of experience in international conflict management, including negotiation of complex ceasefire and peace agreements. And now here we are, Nomi, and I want to ask you, are you optimistic about peace in the Middle East, about the war coming to an end?
It's an excellent question, Odin. I think it's very hard to be optimistic when there is so much bloodshed in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel is talking about retaliating in Iran. And of course, this last war was triggered by the most horrific slaughter carried out by Hamas against Israeli civilians. So it's very hard at the moment to see how this is going to end. But long term, yes, I am optimistic, because at the end of the day, the Israelis and the Palestinians must learn to live together. And there is no other alternative.
Well, when you look at it through your experience, so many years of experience, what is different in this war between Israelis and Palestinians? What has made this kind of difference that things got so far, like we see this kind of bloodshed?
Many things have contributed to this very, very dark place we're at the moment. First and foremost, the leadership, both in Israel and in Palestine and in key countries with leverage, has not contributed to the situation. You need very strong leadership with courage and foresight and highly principled in order to break away from war. And that's why I reiterate, I'm not so optimistic in the short term. It's very hard to be optimistic until there will be a change of leadership. I point the finger at many countries in addition to the Israeli leadership, and also the Palestinian one hasn't done its share. But ultimately, the occupation isn't helping anyone. And there are a number of countries that contributed to the feeling in Israel that the status quo of occupying the West Bank and Gaza is okay. For example, the US has allowed for settlements to expand, and not only the US, Europe, of which Greece is a part of, Europe as a continent has not done anything really in order to stop the settlements. And we have 750,000 settlers in the West Bank, and including East Jerusalem. And it's going to be much more complicated to resolve the conflict now. Whereas you have a situation whereby the local leadership isn't making strides towards peace, the situation that allowed the state to get to this point has many contributing forces from outside. So, for example, local countries, Egypt was the first country to forge a peace agreement with Israel in the 70s, and then in the early 90s, Jordan, and then later on, the Abraham Accords with 2 Gulf states. The Palestinians were not a part of any of the agreements. The agreements were not conditioned on a Palestinian state. And the issue of Palestinian rights to self-determination and statehood was shelved and not given a priority in any country, not in the region and not in the West. It was not a priority, and therefore that was a major mistake at both regional countries and Western countries. I would just like to add, if I may, that the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia came up with an absolutely brilliant offer and a fantastic plan, which is still the basis for the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, later modified and accepted by all the Arab states in 2007 in Beirut. It was actually fought once again by Hamas the day after all the Arab states convened in Beirut to approve the deal. Hamas carried out, at the time, their deadliest attack ever on Israeli civilians in Netanyahu. So there is a pattern there, but not enough was done in order to persuade the Israelis that didn't really believe, given the history of and their narrative and their psychological state of mind and all the fears, that this offer was genuine. But it was genuine, and not enough was done in order to work with Israel towards its implementation. What we really need now is a lot of confidence building, and communities need to really work towards bringing all sides together.
But isn't it becoming more difficult to do that? I mean, there is so much death on both sides. Israelis have lived through the 7th of October, the terrorist attack by Hamas, which was brutal. Now the Palestinians are living through bombings, and children are orphaned. So the next generation, isn't it going to be more difficult for the next generation to talk about peace, to talk about a Palestinian state?
It's much, much, much more difficult, which is why it's so urgent and so important to do, because what is the alternative? More and more and more bloodshed, more war, more trauma, more suffering. And ultimately, at the end of the day, eventually, both Israelis and Palestinians will conclude that they need to live in peace. So the only question is, how long is it going to take, and how much effort is going to be made in order to avoid more bloodshed?
What do you think the role of the United States should be? I mean, what will be their role if Trump is elected, or if Kamala Harris is elected? Are they going to do something? Are they going to pressure Israel?
Yes, I think they will have to, because there has been so much criticism and so much exposure of the US's role in contributing to the situation that we arrived at, and contributing to the wars that have ended in catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. And frankly, it's heading that way in Lebanon, with bombings in Beirut, and no one knows what the exit strategy is. And I do think that whoever is elected is going to imminently try to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. The effective successor to Hassan Nasrallah has said in the last 24 hours that he's seeking a ceasefire in Lebanon. And it's the first time that Hezbollah is separating Lebanon from Gaza, because Nasrallah was adamant all along that a ceasefire in Gaza needs to be the key to Hezbollah stopping their actions. And now that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. But whoever is elected in the US, if it's Trump, he's going to try to weave in both Ukraine and the Middle East, and sort of into a cessation of hostilities at once. If it's Harris, then she may tackle them separately. But there is tremendous pressure on the US to change course, not to veto Security Council resolutions, and to exercise the leverage that the state has. So I don't think you'll see huge, imminent change, but you will see a gradual change. It will be incremental.
What will happen and how things will change if Israel bombs Iran, and with the help of the United States? Because I don't think that Israel can do that without US.
I don't think the US will be involved in any attack on Iran. I don't think that's part and parcel at all of the planning. And I think the US have made it very clear, crystal clear, that they are not going to be a part of any kind of military action on Iran. The US is trying to put a stop to the retaliation. The US has asked Israel not to bomb the nuclear sites in Iran, and not to bomb the oil refineries. The Gulf states have added their plea to that, because they fear that if Israel bombs the oil refineries, Iran will in turn bomb the oil refineries in the Gulf states. So clearly there is a lot of pressure on Israel to carry out a retaliation that will be surgical in kind and precise, and not an all-engulfing one of key strategic nuclear or oil refinery sites. It remains to be seen. It is clear that Benjamin Netanyahu has asked his very extreme right-wing cabinet that would like to bomb both the nuclear sites and the oil refineries to hold fire. It's the eve of Yom Kippur. Nothing is going to happen for at least 48 hours. But the debate continues, and the pressure is not only from the US, it's also from the Gulf states on Israel.
What do you believe the stand of the Arab states will be in the future towards Israel and towards Iran and the Palestinians?
Well, I wouldn't put all the Arab states under one umbrella. They have very different interests. I think that is a huge mistake. And each Arab state has its own national interests and its own strategy. So one has to look at it surgically. I think the GCC is not united in its position. What is clear is that all the Gulf states, all the Arab states would like to avoid war. That is very clear. That is the one uniting element, that they would like the violence, the war in Lebanon, in Gaza, and the direct hits on Iran to stop promptly because it threatens their stability.
But isn't it a matter for Netanyahu, a matter of survival, of personal survival, so that the war continues?
It's an issue for Netanyahu of personal survival and avoiding being tried for corruption. And he's already in the middle of a trial, but as long as the war is going on, the trial is on hold, but he's also going to be held responsible for the events of the 7th of October. So he's trying to avoid both. That is very clear. So again, the question is, when is Netanyahu's term going to end? And I think he's likely to run through his entire term, which ends next spring.
And then what do you believe about the Israelis? How will they vote? Because we know that when you are under so much stress and suffering, you don't always vote, for sometimes you have a turn towards the right and towards the far right.
I think everything depends on when the votes are going to take place, and Netanyahu is going to do all he can to postpone the vote, and he's already claiming victory in Lebanon, which frankly is outrageous, because whereas Hezbollah's capabilities have been diminished by half, according to Israeli sources, the situation is far from resolved, and more rockets are flying over into northern Israel with more casualties than ever before. And as I said earlier, the exit strategy isn't clear, but it will very, very much depend on where we're at in terms of the war. Is a huge movement in Israel to end the occupation and move towards peace. You see demonstrations of hundreds of thousands every Saturday. They're not only demonstrating to get the 101 hostages released, they're demonstrating to address the root causes. And from their point of view, the root cause is, to a large extent, the occupation, and they just want the hostages back in peace. But the road in terms of how to get there is going to be full of hurdles, and I would not want to predict today how the electorate is going to vote. I don't think Netanyahu will be re-elected, but there are plenty of leaders on the right that are in the thick of the election campaign, including Naftali Bennett, who's very vocal and quite popular. You also have on the left Yair Golan, the new leader of the Labour Party, who immediately remedied the mistakes of his predecessor, Merav Michaeli, who split from Meretz and lost many votes. The first thing he did is he joined his party with Meretz, which is another peace party, pro-peace party, pro-Palestinian state. So very much will depend on the alliances, on how many parties in the center-left will stick together and run as a bloc, and how many in the right. One of the reasons that this government, this extreme right-wing government in Israel, came to power was because now the two well-known figures, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, both their parties joined for the purpose of running to the election into one party. And the minute the elections were over, they split. So they never had any intention of sticking to one party. So the right was far smarter in the election tactic. The left was really made every mistake possible in splitting all the parties, and there was a lot of infighting. We've also seen that since the 7th of October. We've seen the center-left bloc not being united in trying to persuade 5 Likud members to change to the opposition. That was what I would have expected them to do, instead of making statements and sort of fighting among themselves on who is the leader. You would have expected them to put all their efforts into bringing down the government by persuading the more center elements within Likud. And I was so surprised, and I wasn't the only one, that this didn't happen, and that the ministers in Likud, all of them, chose to stay in this government that was passing anti-democratic laws very quickly. And they chose war in Gaza instead of negotiating the return of the hostages.
I thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you so much. And we will talk again. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
I do believe that every individual has a role to play in contributing to a better understanding of the other, and in turn, that would lead to resolving conflicts. Because with all the hatred and deep division that is caused by anger, social media, and very heightened emotions, that only feeds into the narratives of the leaders that believe that they're victims of this witch hunt. That's their perception. And if only rhetoric was toned down and communities were built in order to forge better understanding towards solutions, which in this case is 2 states and coexistence, we would be in a much better place. So, for example, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the ones living within the Green Line, and Israeli Jews, Christians and Muslims, Israeli Jews and the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are Muslim and Christian, coexist, and coexist fairly well with Palestinian members in the Knesset, and they were actually the first to help out, or among the first, after the horrific attacks of the 7th of October. And they donated blood, they brought food, they cooked. There was very much part of the community in a set, and they were very quick to distinguish themselves from those who carried out the horrendous massacres. And for anyone listening to this podcast, I do think that if one just thinks, instead of fanning out rhetoric that is inflammatory, trying to work towards how the bridging, what can each individual do in order to make the world a more peaceful place. I think it's very important to try to understand the history, culture, and narrative of the other. Each side views itself as a victim. Each side teaches in school its own victimhood narrative. In order to try to move forward, it's very important to view everything through a much broader lens and reach out by studying the narrative of the other, the history, the culture, even if one doesn't agree with their narrative, at least to be aware of it and know that it exists and try to respect it.